In this video, we will be covering some of the most tragic and dark unsolved murders, disappearances, uncaught serial killers, and a few strange encounters, geographical and archaeological mysteries, and a few uncategorized ones, and much more. As always, grab a drink. My choice today is English tea with maple syrup, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries iceberg. And just a quick shout out for those who don't know, I have officially launched the first ever merch on this channel. We have this one here on a lovely mug. Let me just try and get that in focus. But yeah, very cool curiosity design, and these are all completely original designs, not using AI, done by a proper human artist. And in the shop, link down below, there's 10% off everything at the moment, but we also do jumpers, sweaters, hoodies, we have caps, and in case you like the designs so much that you want to just plaster them everywhere, we also do all the designs in sticker form. There's even these which are like 90% off. Like, I literally make no profit from these ones. They're just a very cool little QR code design. And for the first 10 orders that go out, I will be writing a personalized handwritten letter. That's just my way of saying thank you to you guys for supporting the channel and for picking up some really cool looking merch at the same time. So the shop is down below. You can use the code ONETRUEFAN for, as I said, 10% off everything. As always, guys, thank you in every way you support the channel. And now let's get into our first entry. The Millbrook Twins were these two girls, 15-year-old twins, Danette and Jeanette Millbrook, and they went missing from their local neighborhood just outside of Georgia, Atlanta in the 1990s. And in my opinion, this was a very disappointing case, you know, just disappointing on the work of the investigators, because in my opinion, they did fumble a few things. They definitely could have put more effort into this case, but we'll get into that a little bit later in the story. And for now, we will just start on this one afternoon in March when Danette and Jeanette were out about, you know, as you do when you're a teenager. They were hanging out with friends. They went to a local fast food place for lunch. And when they came home, this will be important later, but they told their mother that they were a little bit concerned because there was a white van following them when they made their way home. And I guess their mum didn't really take it too seriously. The girls didn't seem to take it too seriously either. And it was less like a massive concern to be worried about and more like maybe an annoyance, maybe, you know, something to laugh at, like, oh, there was this weird guy following us. But apparently being unconcerned, the girls went out again, and after being out for a few hours, they were kind of making their way home, and on their way home, they decided to make a few stops. So they stopped first at their godfather's and family friend's home. They talked with him for a bit. He ended up giving them some bus fare for school next week, and also a bit of extra money to buy some snacks and stuff on the way home. Then they left their godfather's home. They went to visit their cousin who lived pretty much nearby, and they talked to their cousin for a bit before asking them if they would like to walk home with them. Their cousin's mum ended up saying she wasn't allowed because it was starting to get a bit dark, but this would be the first sign that these twins were maybe a tiny bit concerned about walking home alone, because after leaving their cousin's house, they would then make a stop at their older sister's home. And again, after talking to her for a little while, they asked her if she would walk back home with them. Their older sister also declined because she had just given birth. She said she wanted to just stay at home, relax. And so the twins then left her home. They stopped by a local gas station, and the worker in the gas station knew the girls and said there wasn't really anything off about them. You know, they seemed pretty normal, pretty standard. They bought some snacks, you know, soda, candy, etc. And then they were seen on camera leaving the gas station, and then they were never seen again. And we'll get into a little bit about how badly the police, I think, fudged this case. But at the time of the girls' disappearances, their entire description at this point was known. You know, their height, what they were wearing, what their hairstyles were, and some distinct physical features that would have helped identify the girls, would have made them easier to recognize or to point out or spot. But rewind back to just after the gas station. The girls obviously didn't return home. Their family filed a missing persons report for both of them, but they were told they had to wait at least 24 hours before filing this report. So the family did a bit of waiting. In the meantime, they, contacted friends and family. They searched the local area, but nobody had really seen the girls. They weren't able to find any sign of them. And when the 24 hours came, they put in an official report and a search was started. And I say a search was started, but it was really less like a search and more like whatever the opposite of a search is. Basically, the police didn't do a whole lot. They interviewed like one or two people. They did like rudimentary searches of, the local areas. Just a lot of stuff that the family had done by this point already anyway. They didn't arrest anyone. There were no real suspects arrested or investigated or interviewed. There were also a bunch of mistakes made on the file. For one, the girls' names were misspelt often in both the official police report and in the media, and they were on one or two occasions actually mistaken for either their older or younger sisters. The police basically went as far as like knocking on a few doors, being like, have you seen this girl or these girls? And when they were like, no, we haven't seen them, the police were like, case closed, I guess. It was a pretty shoddy job. And then after just 1 year, the case was officially closed, which was awfully strange. The family inquired about this, and they were told that the case was closed because the girls had actually been found. Except they hadn't been found, and this was just one of the many silly mistakes made by the police. And then the police changed their mind again and said that the girls were found, and they said that in their reports the girls had been taken from their family home and then put into an orphanage and then put up for adoption, and since they were now adopted they were no longer missing, and so they closed the case. Except all of this was just complete nonsense. It was either completely made up, or more likely it was a mix-up, a confusion, because there were other family members who were up for adoption or who had been adopted, and so again the police seem to have confused these girls with some of their family members and then said, oh, they were adopted, they weren't missing. And it's just like, what the hell is even this case? Then the investigators said, okay, they're still missing, they weren't adopted, but in their opinion, it is very likely that the girls ran away. What evidence they were basing this on, I have no idea. And since they were now 17 years old, even if they were found, they weren't able to legally, oblige them to come home. And so, even if they were found, there was no point in reopening the case, which is just absolute madness. Like, surely if they did run away and they were of an age where the police weren't able to legally bring them home or whatever, then surely still they would, still be a missing person until they were actually officially physically found. Like, this whole case and just the handling of the case seems to me like just pure and utter chaos. But that is in the end what ended up happening. The case remained closed. The girls were taken off the official missing children's list, or, the database. And it wasn't until over 20 years later that, due to, media pressure, due to pressure from the family, this case was officially reopened. And there is to this day a small 5-figure sum for anyone with, information actually leading to the girls. And since reopening it, there have been, a few kind of light investigations, as you might do with some old cold cases. They've done more interviews since then. They've collected some family DNA and compared it to a few Jane Does found, but none of them were a match. And still, to this day, there's no real progress made on the case. We still don't know the identity of whoever might have been following them. This man driving a white van. We don't know the type of van, the number plate, what the man looked like. And there were one or two theories about this being like an inside job sort of thing, with their father having maybe abducted them or taken them or moved away with them or something like that. But as far as I can tell, as far as the information that's available to, the public, there doesn't seem to be too much evidence for that theory. And so this case still remains unsolved to this day. I knew I was forgetting something. The Minnesota Wood Wizards is a very strange one indeed. But this was the experience of one Duke Rialto. And as the author notes, this is not his real name, because if it was his real name, if it was anyone's real name, that would be amazing. But the person this happened to apparently wanted to remain anonymous, and so they've used a fake name here. But he swears that the story he told is 100% completely honest and true. But Duke Rialto was one day, or rather one night, in August 1991, driving through these woods. And it was in Minnesota. He was driving up to meet his friends in a cabin, as they had this whole, trip planned, this cabin trip / fishing trip. And so after he was driving for hours, in the middle of the night, his truck, of course, broke down. And so Duke gets out of his truck, he looks around for maybe a store or a garage or a house or something, doesn't find anything, but he does find a vague glowing light in the woods. And he thinks this might be a cabin, it might be another car that stopped perhaps, it might be, a campfire. Basically, it might be someone who could help, and anything at this point would be better than just staying in the middle of the woods. So he grabs his flashlight, he grabs his pistol, because you can never be too careful in a Minnesota woods, and he heads out through the trees towards this glow. And as he's pushing past branches, pushing through the trees, this glow slowly gets, larger and closer and brighter, and then slowly he sees these three kind of figures, these three men standing around the glow. He describes the men as like strange, stiff. He said they weren't standing there like a normal human might, like all casual and human-like. I'm not doing a very good impression of a human right now. Not that I would need to do an impression. I am 100% human, but he said they reminded him more of like statues or robots or maybe even aliens or just some other creature besides a natural human. And the light, he said, when he was in the woods, when he saw it, he said it wasn't a campfire, but it was more like a weird kind of soft glow. It was quite steady, it was quite uniform, it wasn't really flickering like a campfire might. And then as he approached them even closer, all of a sudden these figures like kind of jumped up. They seemed to act more human. They were like, oh shit, we're supposed to be human. And then they, boom, transformed this glow into an actual campfire. And the men were like, doop-a-doo, nothing strange to see here. Just three human men standing around a campfire. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but basically the men, acted strange. They were dressed strangely. They had like apparently these weird frilly pants on. They had these deep purple shirts with like no buttons. And one of them, it was described, even had a cape. Yeah, a bloody cape in the 21st century. And a gold ornament clasp and these strange shoes, and just all round they were dressed very oddly. Then as Duke, approached these men and started conversation with them, as well as just acting and dressing strange, they also spoke really strangely. He said their accent was a bit off. It was like vaguely foreign, but whether that was like French or Russian or English even, he wasn't really sure. And so he went up to them, he broke the ice, he said hello, and he said, if you'd be able to help me, my truck's broken down there. One of these men apparently stepped forward and said to him, and I quote, "You lathed your feet and joined us here to be happy." All three, which, yeah, that's a completely normal response. I don't know what this Duke guy was even concerned about. And then another one of the men stepped in and said, "The Eon, is it of, sir?" And Duke replied, "What the fuck are you talking about? He didn't say that. He said, what do you mean by Eon? And the three men then all looked at each other, and then one of them said, you more to say? We hear more to say. Which my head is hurting just reading these lines. And that was more or less it. Duke said he talked to them for a little bit longer, and he said they felt kind of like aliens or robots or, you know, AI sort of thing, where they knew human words and they knew roughly how to put them together, but like it was completely out of context, it didn't make sense. And so he eventually said his goodbyes, and one of the men saw him off with the line, "For positive." Yes, and that was it. Duke said the men didn't have any tents around this campfire. They didn't have any cars or trucks or supplies of any kind. It was just three weirdly sounding, weirdly dressed dudes standing around a campfire with nothing else there. You know, it's like, how the hell did they even get out there in the first place? All standing around a campfire in the middle of the night. Very strange. But Duke eventually went back to his truck, and since he couldn't fix it, he decided to just walk the way there. You know, he wasn't too far away, but it was a good, you know, hour or 2 or 3 walk. And eventually he made it. He met up with his friends in this cabin. He told them the tale of these 3 strange dudes in the woods, and they basically laughed at him, said he was making it up, said he was crazy. But as to what he actually saw and encountered, leave me your theories on that in the comments below. Misty Copsey was a 14-year-old girl who went missing in Washington in 1992, and she was out most of the day at the Puyallup Fairgrounds, which, you know, is a pretty standard fun fair sort of place. They have rides and carnival things and popcorn and cotton candy, but she was there most of the day with her 15-year-old friend Trina, and she had just missed her 8:40 p.m. bus going home. So she called her mum. She said that she had just missed this bus, but it was fine because she said she had called her 18-year-old friend Ruben Schmidt and asked him to pick her up. Her mum then told her that no, she didn't trust Ruben at all. You know, she thought he was sleazy, thought he was a dodgy character, and so she told Misty to try and grab a ride home with someone else. And at this time, after Misty had this phone call with her mother, according to Trina, Misty and Trina then decided to basically walk home, with Trina living around 30 minutes walk from the carnival, and Misty living around 2 to 3 hours away. But this was later found out to be a lie, and Trina had in fact got a lift home that night, and this was from her 23-year-old boyfriend, with her only being 15, which I'm pretty sure is illegal, but from her 23-year-old boyfriend, Michael Reiner. Misty apparently didn't like or trust Michael, and so even though Trina said that she offered Misty a ride home as well, she said, yeah, come with us, Michael will drop you home. Apparently Misty refused this and chose to just take the long walk home instead. Now, this case is very strange for a few reasons. One, even though Misty was reported missing the next day, the case wouldn't properly be started for a few months, as apparently there was some mix-up. Misty was reported missing a while before this, you know, on a separate occasion, but it turned out she was just, you know, away from home. She was staying at friends' houses, she wasn't answering her phone, etc. And so the police thought that this might be the case in this instance. And also there were a few, you know, interviews, a few statements made by some of Misty's friends and classmates that said that they're pretty sure that they saw Misty a few days after Misty's disappearance. So there was 1 or 2 people who said like, yeah, I saw her. Pretty sure it was her. I saw her on the street in this, you know, vague thing like a week ago, and I'm pretty sure it was Misty. And then the police kind of gathered all this, you know, the fact that she had been missing before, the fact that there were a few people who maybe kind of vaguely saw her, and so police thought, okay, it's pretty likely she's still around. She isn't really like missing, and so they kind of delayed everything. They didn't take it seriously, and eventually they just closed the case, which doesn't make any sense to me. Like, surely even if you believe that, Misty is still just 14 years old. So even if you thought that she had ran away and she was staying with friends or whatever, like surely you would still keep the missing persons case open. But originally, once the case, was up and running, the police initially suspected Michael, Trina's 23-year-old boyfriend, as he had a little bit of a history. He was once accused when he was 16 years old of kidnapping and abusing an 11-year-old girl. And now he's dating a 15-year-old girl. So yeah, great guy, this Michael. But police at the time suspected that Michael perhaps had dropped Trina home and then gone back along the road, picked up Misty, and then did something with her. And then the police polygraphed him. He apparently passed it, and so he was, knocked down a few rungs on the suspect ladder. Then police started to suspect Ruben Schmidt, the 18-year-old who the mum thought was a little bit dodgy, who Misty had called to request him picking her up. And when he was interviewed, he told the police that, yes, Misty did call me, but I told her that I couldn't pick her up because I didn't have enough gas. And then Misty apparently called him back and said, look, if you just pop over to my house, you can get some money there, then you can go and buy gas. And he told Misty then that he didn't even have enough gas in his car to, go from his house to Misty's, which was only like a few minutes away. So this guy may as well not even have a car. Somehow he's run the gas out so much, probably dried it out with a sponge, that he probably can't even leave his own driveway. But after this second phone call, Ruben's roommate told police that Ruben then left the flat, and the roommate assumed that Ruben was actually going to pick Misty up. But when Ruben was asked about this, he said that he just blacked out. Literally, he said after this second phone call with Misty, he remembers absolutely nothing. He just out of his memory. And so he agreed then to a polygraph test, and the results came back undetermined. And when he was asked on the test whether he potentially could have done something to Misty, he said he didn't really know. And then he woke up the next day after Misty's disappearance. He woke up at his grandmother's house, which is strange because the distance from his house to his grandmother's house is further than the complete journey from his house to the fair and then back to his house. So it's a bit strange considering he said he had like zero gas. There were also, over the course of this investigation, several reports by people who Ruben had spoken to, where Ruben had apparently told them that Misty's remains were buried on his grandma's property. And when police brought this up with him, he said that yes, he did say these things, but that he didn't really mean it. It was just to get people off his back, get people to stop bothering him about this whole Misty thing, which is like insanely suspicious. Like, that's not a normal thing that people do. Like, just admitting to murdering a 14-year-old girl just to get people to stop asking questions about it. That's just an insane statement. And then he agreed to take a second polygraph test, which he then passed. So police at this point were like very confused, and they did later search his grandma's property, for clues, for evidence, for remains, but they didn't find anything of value. Ruben was later accused of, intimate assault by a female friend of his. Then his wife later had to take out a restraining order against him, and he would also later be accused of theft. So definitely not the soundest of guys. Bit of a dirtbag if you ask me. But over the next few weeks, months, years, there were various searches done for Misty, and they did end up finding her underwear, her jeans, one of her socks in a ditch, and this ditch was by the side of a highway 60 to 100 kilometers away from where she was last seen. They also then found Misty's toothbrush and her hairbrush, both of which she would have had on her at the time. And so I think it's very obvious that something happened to Misty, something very likely quite dark, but by who exactly, we don't really know. You know, Ruben and Michael both seem like a little bit suspicious, both very likely of doing something like this, but there's also not too much evidence for necessarily either one of them. And there was another local suspect, a man named Corey Bober, who he came forward during the investigation. He contacted Misty's mum and said that he suspected that the disappearance of Misty and the disappearances of two other girls in the same local area, Anna Chebetnoy in 1990 and Kimberly Delange in 1988, that they were in fact all three of them related, and he suspected that they were all done by the same person. And initially Misty's mum was kind of happy with this, you know, that someone else was taking an interest in her child's disappearance, helping with the investigation perhaps. But then he started to act a bit strange. Misty's mum started to suspect Corey of the crimes, and to prove his innocence, he said, you know, I've got nothing to do with it. I'll even take a polygraph test. And when they booked him in for that, he then cancelled it and has never done one to this day. So as far as suspects go, it's a little all over the place. Hopefully someday, maybe someday soon, we will find, you know, a little bit of extra evidence, something to actually pin someone, and so, you know, be able to do Misty some justice. But until that day, this case will sadly remain unsolved. Mount Kailash is a bit of a strange one. There's not too deep of a mystery for this one, but it's basically a mountain in Tibet that, while being quite a important symbol in, you know, a lot of Buddhist stories and history and tales and legends, etc., is also thought to be evidence of some very strange happenings, in that it is kind of pyramid shaped, kind of. As you can see here, it's kind of sloped on the edges, a little bit jaggedy, kind of stepped in a way, and it looks like it could maybe be a pyramid, kind of like a ziggurat if you know, squint really hard. But either way, it's a very cool structure. But whether it is a natural mountain, you know, worn down by weather or wind, or whether it's an ancient structure created by an ancient people that time forgot, or whether, you know, aliens came in, zapped a laser at this mountain and then, you know, shaped it with their laser technology. I mean, I'm not really sure. But as always with these types of ones, let me know what you think in the comments below. Mount Vernon Jane Doe is another one of these cases that has actually been solved, and I may need to make a separate video on this at a later date, you know, covering all the cases that I've already covered, but just the ones that have updates on, or, you know, that have been solved since I made the video. But this was a Jane Doe originally, who was found strangled to death and left by the side of a road in Mount Vernon, New York. And this was by like an industrial estate on, you know, the quiet side of town where no one ever really went. It was all the way back in 1988 when the body was found. And this Jane Doe at the time was completely naked. She had cuts and marks, you know, like cable tie marks or rope or something on her wrists, on her legs and ankles, meaning that she was likely, you know, bound up, killed, and then dumped here. And nobody knew who she was all the way up until 2021, more than 30 years later, when DNA from the case was tested with new methods. They were able to match up this DNA with some of her relatives, and from there they were able to, you know, ask them if they had anyone missing in the family, and they made this connection between this Jane Doe and a woman named Veronica Widerhole. She went missing years ago, was never found, and so it turned this Jane Doe case into, you know, a case of an unsolved murder basically. But although they ended up identifying her as far as who might have been involved, who actually killed her, for what reason, etc., we still to this day have no idea. The murder of Pier Paolo Pasolini was incredibly brutal, and Pier, as you know, a little bit of background on him, he was big into the arts, into films, into film directing and poetry and writing, etc. But I think more important than all of that, at least to this case, were his political beliefs, and we'll explain those in just a little bit. But on this day in 1975, Pier was found dead on a beach in Ostia, Italy, and he had been the victim of an absolutely brutal attack. He was beaten incredibly badly, punched, kicked, smashed with objects. He was severely bleeding. He was bruised all over his body. Several of his bones were broken. He had his man jewels crushed, just smashed with a metal pipe. And he had also been run over with his own car and was then set on fire. And who may have committed this horrific attack? Well, police at the time were convinced that this wasn't just like, a random attack, like a spur of the moment, crazy person come in. They were pretty convinced that Pier was targeted specifically and that this was likely a targeted attack, perhaps by some organized group, and was absolutely, in their mind, meant to send a message. And who typically does these sorts of attacks? Who likes to send messages with their attacks, especially in Italy? If you guessed mafia, then you deserve a sticker. But as to why the mafia might attack Pier, that is when we have to explore a bit of his political beliefs. And politically, Pier was quite outspoken. He rarely kind of kept anything secret. He was just like, yeah, I'm annoyed at this thing. These people are terrible. These people are horrible. Like, he was very outspoken. And he also was very pro-communist. He said that at the time, communism was the only way forward. It was the only way to, develop a good life in Italy. And over time, he went more and more to the communism side, and so moved further and further away from the Christian democratic side, who he often accused of, being corrupt, of being greedy, of cheating and scamming the people, of bribery, of sabotaging his causes. And he said that they were basically a religious dictatorship, and that they were even as bad as fascists, except they were even worse, because he said at least fascists, were upfront about it. Fascists were like, yeah, we're going to be in control, we're going to have all the power, whereas he said the democratic Christians basically wanted to do the same thing. He said they wanted to take everyone's money, everyone's power, but they did it under the guise of like safety or kindness. Like the church has received a divine message that you need to give up all your money and all of your rights to us. He said they were basically dictators in disguise. And he said they further controlled people with, morals and the teachings of the party and the church, even though they themselves didn't follow a lot of their own rules. He also accused the party of being massively influenced by the mafia, and he said the mafia was bribing them, they were bribing the mafia was putting out hits and kind of riling up violence for the party. But because the two were officially disconnected, nobody ever put two and two together. And he also accused them of being absolutely riddled with like mafia influence and mafia corruption. He accused them of working closely with the CIA and covering up bombings by, violent fascists, all just in an attempt to shut down the left, to shut down communism. And then it seems after all of this, after being outspoken for years, he was killed in a very mafia-esque sort of fashion. So yes, technically this case is unsolved, but I think it's maybe quite obvious who orchestrated this attack. But at the time, this was obviously in 1975, police caught 17-year-old Giuseppe Pino Pelosi, who knew Pier at the time, and they caught him because he was driving around in Pier's car. And at the time, after some police interrogations, police interviews, Pelosi actually admitted to killing Pier. And he said he did this all alone, completely on his own. There was no one else involved. And since they didn't have any further evidence, they charged him and him alone for this crime, sentencing him to 9 years, with it being added in his notes that he committed this murder/attack likely with other people. And this confession he made was 29 years later retracted by himself, as he said at the time he had made this confession, which was a false confession. He said he had made it to protect his family. His family had been threatened that if you don't confess, then something's gonna happen to them. And then after all this time, after he retracted his confession, he said that yes, while I didn't kill Pier, I saw who did, and it was 3 southern men with accents, and that still Pier was a dirty communist. So that's nice. As I said, there were very, very likely other people involved in this case, or in this killing, and whether Giuseppe was involved with these other people, or whether he was, not involved in any way and was perhaps just a scapegoat, we might never know. The MV Joyita was a ship found drifting around the South Pacific Ocean in 1995 with no one aboard. And it was a little wooden ship, or, little compared to the Titanic, but it was about this big for reference. And it was designed originally as a luxury yacht, but was eventually used in World War II in Pearl Harbor by the US Navy. And by the end of the war, or rather after the war, it was sold on, subsequently lined with cork on the inside, and this will be important later. But after this, the ship then changed hands a few times before being used eventually as a trading and fishing boat by a British man, a captain named Thomas H. Dusty Miller. And so that's more or less the history for this boat. But up until it was seemingly abandoned, in the days and weeks prior to it, it had planned to go from Samoa to the Tokelau Islands, roughly 270 miles or 430 kilometers away. And the ship left the Apia harbor in Samoa at around 5 a.m. on October the 3rd, 1955. And on board were 16 crew members as well as 9 passengers, including, but not limited to, a government official, a businessman set to buy large amounts of coconut flesh, 2 children, very sadly, and a former World War II surgeon who was actually set to perform an amputation on someone in the Tokelau Islands. And also aboard, very importantly, was wood, like logs, otherwise known as very buoyant, hard things, and 80 large empty oil drums, which they too would have been quite buoyant. And so between the wood, between the empty oil drums, and between the cork that was lined in the ship, they would come to find that the Joyita was damn near unsinkable. And so the ship set off, as I said, at 5 a.m. It was heading through its 2-day journey, but when the ship didn't arrive in the Tokelau Islands, on schedule 2 days later, they then put out a call saying that the ship was lost or that it was late, looking for some sort of information, anyone that had seen her, maybe from the ship itself. But the ship never responded. Any replies that did come in said that they hadn't seen her at all, they hadn't seen her nearby, and so they performed a week-long search covering nearly 100,000 square miles or 260,000 square kilometers of ocean, but no boat or any evidence of the boat or any passengers or any bits of it or anything like that were at the time found until 5 weeks later, when a merchant ship was just out doing its regular route, and there, out on the water, it spotted a fairly damaged, actually mostly abandoned ship, quite badly battered, but still floating in the ocean. It had a bunch of missing cargo, and when they pulled the ship in, when they inspected it more closely, they found that all of its lifeboats had been used, and that its radio had been set to 2182 kilohertz, otherwise known as the International Distress Channel. But there was no one aboard, no other evidence as to what might have happened, and so it seems like for whatever reason, something happened to the ship. Maybe the captain ended up dying, or some of the important crew members. People panicked, they weren't able to, contact anyone, and they didn't know that the ship was basically unsinkable, and if they just stayed on the ship, they would have just been fine. So maybe they saw the ship was damaged, they thought the ship was going down, they took the lifeboats off, and then, in the middle of a crazy ocean just in a lifeboat, your odds don't fare very well. And there was some evidence, that the ship had damaged parts, and this was noted before the ship had even left its port. There was a problem with one of the engines. They thought, it should be fine, the other engine is working, and so this perhaps, maybe likely is what caused the accident, the incident. But even if something did happen, the captain should very well have known that, the boat was completely buoyant, everything should have been fine even if, the engines stopped, and it was far riskier for everyone to get into these lifeboats as opposed to just staying in the main ship. As I said, there's no real further evidence they found as to what might have happened, and so to this day it's based on a little bit of evidence, but also speculation, also theories, and we still don't fully know what caused that ship to go down, at least partially go down, and what caused the passengers and the crew members on it to completely abandon it, and what ended up happening to them. The Myasokombinat Jane Doe is a short but still quite brutal case, and this case was in 2007 in a place called Buryatia, which is an area in East Russia. But this Jane Doe who was found and her killer, Kailash Orenbayev, they met in the city under unknown circumstances, but they then got to talking. They took a taxi out to the village of Myasokombinat, which was, a fairly short taxi ride, and then they sat on the banks of the Uda River just having a few drinks, talking, maybe flirting a little bit. Kailash then made a move onto this Jane Doe. He tried to have coitus with her. She apparently refused his advances, and so he ended up strangling her to death and having intercourse with her dead body. Yeah. He then left her on the side of this river. He went home, and then he returned the next day. The body apparently hadn't been found, so he just cut her into pieces and threw her body in the river. Kailash was later caught. He was later charged and convicted for the murders of 2 other women, but the Myasokombinat Jane Doe was just never identified. He didn't know who she was. Apparently no one else was able to pin an identity on her, and so she to this day remains a Jane Doe. Newcomb's paradox is a mathematical problem, kind of a thought experiment, and it's a pretty fun one, a pretty interesting one, but it is a little bit complex, so forgive me if it gets a tiny bit confusing. But imagine you have 2 boxes. You have box A, which is completely clear, completely transparent. You can always see everything inside of it, and inside this box A is always $1,000. Then there is a box B, which is completely opaque, which means it's solid, you can't see anything in it, and for the purposes of this puzzle there's no way of shaking them or scanning them or something. And so here is the paradox. As well as there being 2 boxes, box A and box B, there are also 2 players. You are one player and the other player is what's known as a perfect predictor. So whether this is, an AI or a computer or some sort of divine being, they are able to predict basically with almost 100% certainty, but not exactly 100% because then it would be able to, see the future essentially. But it can predict with 99.99999% certainty which of the 2 boxes you will choose. And so here is the key part of the paradox. We know box A always has $1,000, but for box B, it can either contain $1 million or nothing at all. And if the box predicts that you will open both of these boxes, then it will set the value of box B to 0. But if it predicts you'll only take box B, you'll leave behind box A, then it will set the value of box B to $1 million. And so here's kind of where the dilemma comes in, because the question is obvious. Which is the correct choice? After the perfect predictor has, looked at you, it's weighed up all of the odds, it makes a prediction, it puts either $0 or $1 million into box B, and then it asks you to decide whether you want just box B or whether you want to take both of the boxes. Now, here's kind of where the problem comes in, and that's the fact that these boxes, the values within them, have already been set by the time you choose to, choose between the two. So for some people, they say the correct decision is, well, if this perfect predictor is so good, if I pick both of the boxes, it would have predicted that. And so box B would be empty, leaving me with only $1,000. But if I just pick box B, then hopefully this robot will have predicted that, and I will walk away with a sweet million. So this side says take only box B, hopefully the perfect predictor is correct, and you get $1 million. Whereas the other side of the argument says that whatever prediction that this person made, they've already made it. So, you know, as I said, by the time you go to make the decision, the prediction has already been made. The money's already either put into the box, you know, whether it's $1 million or zero. And so your choice at this current moment in time makes absolutely no difference to the values in the box. And so whether this perfect predictor predicted that you would pick both, or whether it predicted that you would pick one or the other or whatever, then your fate's kind of already been sealed. And so you picking just box B doesn't make any sense when your decision won't affect the value of the box, and you can see with 100% certainty $1,000 in box A. So the other argument says always just take both boxes because the boxes have already been filled. Your decision doesn't make a difference in that. And this way you are guaranteed just an extra $1,000. So it's a little tricky. Both arguments kind of make sense in a way to me. And I think I would probably go with, see, I don't even know myself at this point. I'd probably go with taking both boxes, but then maybe the robot would have predicted that and I'd just walk away with, you know, not the million. But definitely a very interesting one. Let me know what you would pick down below. And let me know if your decision would change if there was a third box. And in that third box was always a awesome Curiosity mug. Shameless plug, but honestly, look at the design. It is so cool. But on to the next entry. Noreen Greenley was a 13-year-old girl who went missing in 1963 in Ontario after leaving a friend's house one September evening. And it was September 14th in 1963, and Noreen's friend Bonnie, and Bonnie's boyfriend Gary were all out at a bowling alley. They, you know, bowled some balls, they had some food, they had dinner, and then they went back to Bonnie's house where they all basically just hung out for a while. Then Bonnie and her boyfriend wanted, you know, a bit of alone time, and so Noreen at around 11:30 p.m. agreed to, you know, I'm gonna head home now. She left Bonnie's house, she walked across the road to the nearby bus stop, and then went quickly back inside. She had a quick word with Bonnie and then went back out again. And after leaving for this second time, Noreen was never seen again. The bus driver, when interviewed, said that she was never there, or, you know, rather that he never saw her when he pulled up with his bus. She never got on. He didn't see her standing around anywhere. And there was a witness for this case. Someone who said that they saw a young girl, which may or may not have been Noreen, getting into a blue 1957 Ford Prefect, driven by a man with a dark hat on. But this same car was apparently seen by Noreen's younger sister and her younger sister's friend as they were out hanging around near Noreen's home, and they saw this car kind of speed past. It almost hit the younger sister, and they heard a faint scream coming from the car, which they say may very likely have been Noreen. And after this happened, Noreen's brother and father then got into their car and tried to make chase, but they ended up losing the car. They ended up then calling the police, filing a, you know, missing persons report, an abduction report. But sadly, even though an investigation and search was started, after that day, Noreen was never seen again. And honestly, this case kind of just broke the entire family. The family spent tons of money, tons of their savings in looking for Noreen. You know, they would pay for advertisements, for billboards. They would constantly miss work in order to arrange searches for her. They would also fly to different parts of America, to Canada, on, like, you know, the off chance someone sighted a girl that maybe could have been Noreen, and they would just, book a flight out there, try and find her. And eventually, Noreen's dad ended up dying of a brain aneurysm, possibly from all of the stress from this situation. And her mum then fell into alcoholism. Noreen's 3 younger siblings had to be taken into an orphanage and, put up for foster care because their parents weren't there to look after them. And so all round, this is an incredibly heartbreaking case. As I said, Noreen was never seen again, and we still don't know to this day who might have been responsible for her abduction. The Oakland County child killer was a man who killed at least 4 children in Oakland County, Michigan between 1976 and 1977. And just a warning, if you're in a good mood and don't, want it ruined with an absolutely horrific case, or if you're just maybe extra sensitive about cases and crimes involving children, maybe give this one a bit of a miss. But there were 4 main cases of children being abducted, being abused, and being killed, all around this area around this time, with many more cases put on, the maybe list for this killer. But the main 4 that were linked to him were 12-year-old Mark Douglas Stebbins, who was on his way home one February day. He never turned up and was found 4 days later in the same clothes that he went missing in, strangled to death and dumped in a pile of dirt in a local car park. He had been assaulted, abused with a foreign object, and he had restraint marks, either from a rope or a cable tie of some sort, meaning that he was likely kept somewhere and tied up for a while before being killed. Then there was Jill Robinson, a 12-year-old girl who had a fight with her mum one Christmas, and so she, left her home, she stormed out of the house, and she was never seen alive again. The next day, her bike was found, and then 3 days later, her body was found, dumped along a highway within view of the local police station, which surely can't have been an accident. Whoever did this was clearly toying with the people. Clearly they wanted attention of some sort and thought they were being daring, brazen, being so ballsy as to leave the body outside of a police station. So this is clearly an arrogant, sick individual. And Jill had been shot in the face with a shotgun and was wearing all the same clothes she went missing in. She still had a backpack. She was also kept captive for a few days. She, was seemingly pampered a little bit, had her nails cleaned, had her hair combed, and she was fed during this time. Then there was 10-year-old Christine Marie Mihalik, and this was just a week after Jill's murder. But Christine had gone out to a 7-Eleven store. She never made it home and was found 19 days later along the side of a road, having been smothered to death. And then finally, there was 11-year-old Timothy John King, who popped out one evening to go to a pharmacy and never returned home. He was found a week later in a shallow ditch alongside a road, and once again had been abused, also with a foreign object, and then suffocated to death. There was also on the maybe list for this killer 17-year-old Donna Sarah, who went missing while hitchhiking and whose body turned up several days later. 13-year-old Jane Louise Allen, who was also hitchhiking and then was found in a river 4 days later, over 200 miles away. And there was also 12-year-old Kimberly Alice King, who went outside her friend's house to call her sister using a telephone box. And then after this phone call, apparently went to go back inside her friend's house, but she never made it and has not been seen since. But at the time when these murders were happening, they weren't initially connected to one another, but police started to, kind of see similarities between them and then slowly link them until eventually they were all put under one case. And some of the descriptions for who this person was, what they looked like, they came from, for instance, this woman who said she saw a kid who had a skateboard who potentially could have been Timothy John King, and he was talking to a man outside the pharmacy in the parking lot. And so they wanted to, obviously find this man. They drew up descriptions of him. They said he was maybe driving a blue AMC Gremlin car, because of course a child killer would be driving a Gremlin. But the man was described as a white man, aged between 25 and 35, with long sideburns and medium shaggy hair. And at the time, during this case, while this case was open and active, it was one of the biggest investigations in American history. Police received more than 18,000 different tips, leading to dozens of arrests, many for crimes that weren't even related to this case. So, there'd be a tip like, oh, I saw this guy around that area, he was acting really dodgy, and even though he didn't kill anyone, maybe through, further investigations and interviews with them, they would find that, oh, actually they did perform armed robbery on someone on that same day. And so they were solving a few other crimes. Some were crimes that they didn't even know had happened, but sadly they weren't getting too much closer to solving this, child killer case. They did uncover a huge child material ring, should we say, that they ended up closing down, arresting dozens of people for that. They interviewed every single owner, absolutely anyone who owned an AMC Gremlin in Oakland County, but they didn't seem to be making real headway on the case. That is until a few weeks after Timothy's disappearance, a psychiatrist who was working with the investigation team, they received a letter in the mail that was full of spelling errors, and this letter was written by someone who called themselves Alan. And this Alan said that they were the BDSM slave of another person they called Frank, and said that Frank and themselves had both been in the Vietnam War, and that Frank was so traumatized by this war that he was determined on killing children, specifically children in certain, affluent neighborhoods, because he basically blamed these, middle-class people for voting him into the Vietnam War. And so this was a way to punish them and to get back at them, by killing their children, which is an absolutely wild story. Alan said in this letter that he was slowly losing his sanity, and he said he couldn't do this, any longer. He said he was helping Frank with these murders, and said he would testify against Frank and provide, evidence, provide DNA, provide photos and all of that, enough to convict Frank if he would be granted immunity. He then asked the psychiatrist to basically respond to him by printing in the Detroit Free Press that Sunday the exact words, "Weather Bureau says trees to bloom in 3 weeks." So, Alan could get the newspaper, he could read that and confirm that his letter had been read. They then, through further exchanges, agreed to meet at a particular bar, to hopefully move forward with this evidence, with this conviction, finding out who Frank was, with getting more evidence. But after they arranged this, Alan failed to turn up, and he was never seen or heard from again. And one of the main suspects, I think, in this case was a bit strange. It was a convicted criminal, convicted in crimes against children, called Archibald Edward Sloan. And he was seen as a person of interest. He was investigated, and after searching his car, they found hair samples that matched some hair found on some of these children, the ones that had been killed. But this is the important part, they didn't match Archibald's DNA. So it wasn't Archibald's hair that they found, it was someone else's, a third party that somehow had hair on these murdered children and also in Archibald's car. So it seems likely, at least to me, that it was someone maybe Archibald knew, maybe someone that he lent the car to, or maybe someone who stole his car and used it for these crimes. Although that, I think, is a long shot, just because of the probability of it. Then there was another tip that said that Timothy had been abducted by 2 adults, 2 men, which might actually line up to the letter we had by Alan, Alan and Frank. And apparently one of these people looked a little bit like John Wayne Gacy, who was allegedly around Michigan around this time. So there's at least a slim chance it could have been him. There were obviously a few more suspects with the 18,000 tips. None were super substantial. There wasn't too much evidence for any one suspect in particular. And so this absolutely horrific collection of murders, for some reason it's always worse when it comes to children. They have never been solved, and we don't know who did these killings and attacks still to this day. Occult theories about Francis Bacon. Now, this guy is insanely fascinating, and I could probably make an entire video just on him alone, just covering him, his life, his achievements and accomplishments and theories. It is all honestly completely fascinating. But just as a quick rundown of him, he was a bloody writer, philosopher, scientist, freethinker, religious thinker and advocate, statesman, politician, lawyer, economist, judge, and a pretty nifty tactician, as well as many, many more things. And he, in the 1600s, served in many different parts of the government, served in councils, and was one of the favourite men of King James I of Scotland, England and Ireland. And we won't get too much into some of the political government positions that he held, as there are honestly just too many to cover in this short video. But before we get into the substantial stuff, one interesting fact that I discovered about him was that his father, Sir Nicholas Bacon, married a woman who was Francis Bacon's mother, but she was originally called Anne Cook. And so if Francis had taken both his parents' names, as a double barrel or joint name, he might very well have been Francis Cook Bacon, which I just thought was hilarious. But he was a fantastic philosophical thinker, scientific thinker, constantly pushing the scientific process of rational thought, of deduction and experiments, and not taking knowledge for granted, not assuming things. And this in the modern age is pretty standard, but back then in the 1600s, where there was tons of, propaganda, people had crazy beliefs about witches and voodoo and superstitions and, traditions, and some of which were important. But Francis Bacon advocated for basically questioning everything. And even though he himself was very religious, he often advocated for the fact that we could not know God, or rather we could not know about the existence of God, except through deduction and kind of the scientific process and reason and argument. So he was saying to people, don't assume God exists. We must reason our belief, and he clearly reasoned it because he did believe in God. But even something like that, he wasn't, giving it for free. Even God had to pass through his rigorous logic gate. And as well as all that, he also played a pretty key role in the foundation of a bunch of US states, most notably being Virginia, Carolina, and Newfoundland, with Newfoundland even going so far as to create a stamp with Lord Bacon's face on it, commemorating him in 1910, and with Thomas Jefferson writing that Bacon, Locke, and Newton are the 3 greatest men that have ever lived, without any exception, and as having laid the foundation of these superstructures, which have been raised in the physical and moral sciences. So Thomas Jefferson himself puts Bacon up there with Locke, who we discussed, kind of the founding father of free will, or, individual freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of choice, etc., and the scientific mastermind that was Newton. But he was terrible with money most of his life, and so even though he earned a, quite a bit relatively, he was in pretty decent positions, he had a decently wealthy family, he was still in debt no matter how much he earned. And so eventually, later on in his life, he ended up dying of pneumonia after suddenly getting this erratic, this this crazy idea. He had this idea to test refrigeration, basically. And it was known at the time that, you know, putting things in the cold helped preserve them for longer, you know, whether that was dairy products or meat or anything else really. But there had never really been a rigorous kind of scientific test for it, and that's what Francis wanted to do. And so he went out into the cold one night. He got all of this snow. He asked a local to, you know, kill a chicken, to pluck its feathers, to take its insides out, and he got this snow, put it inside the chicken, and his idea was to, you know, note down absolutely everything, all the details about this experiment, and see, you know, roughly what the temperature was, how different temperatures affected how long something lasted for. And so that was his plan anyway. But in going out into the cold, in, you know, touching all of this snow, he ended up developing pneumonia, and then he was taken to a house, put in a bed to rest, and apparently this bed itself was pretty cold. It was pretty damp in the house, and so that just made his pneumonia even worse, and then he eventually ended up dying from pneumonia. And when he died, he left behind the equivalent of like £2.5 million, which is what, I don't know, just under $4 million or something. But he had debts of around £4 million. So like probably $5.5–6 million. So even though he had millions to his name, his debts were still greater. And as I said, this is a short summary of Francis Bacon's life, of his achievements, of his history, etc. So you can imagine what a full video would be like. I could honestly go on for days about him. But this entry is regarding the occult theories surrounding him, as he was well known, obviously, to be into science and politics, etc. But there are theories surrounding him saying that he was actually also into the occult, into black and white magic, into stuff like alchemy, and that these two things kind of worked off one another. So what he learnt from magic and alchemy, etc., actually helped him develop some of his, you know, regular scientific theories, and what he learnt while doing science helped him discover more about the world of occult, the world of magic and mysteries. But this was never proven. It is just a theory, albeit a very, very interesting one. And there were also theories saying that he was a member of a secret society, whether that was the Freemasons or the Rosicrucians, and that a lot of this debt that he had was actually because he was funding, you know, scientific, occult, magical experiments within, say, Freemasonry. And so he was developing all of this dark knowledge for these secret societies, and that was what he was spending all of his money on. There's another theory that says that he faked his death, and after his supposed death, he traveled around Europe writing under the name of Comte de Gabalis, and was actually another character who we covered in a previous entry, that being Count Saint Germain, a mysterious figure who around this time traveled around Europe, met with rich and powerful people, and who apparently had unlimited knowledge on basically any subject you can think of. Of course, nobody knows who this Count Saint Germain was, but this theory says it was Francis Bacon. And Saint Germain himself was around in like the late 1600s, so it's 1684 to be precise, which means Francis Bacon, if he faked his death and was, you know, acting as this character, would have been 123. But this was explained by saying that Francis Bacon had basically evolved and became enlightened through his, you know, religious worship, and he was basically like a Buddha figure that had risen above life and death, except instead of being in Buddhism, he was in Christianity, which, if you ask me, is one hell of a theory. There are also some theories suggesting that Francis Bacon was Shakespeare, as we don't really fully 100% know the identity of Shakespeare, which is a very cool mystery in and of itself, but that is a mystery for another day. And that is all we have time for. I'm trying to get these out a little more regularly, so hopefully you won't have to wait too long for the next one. As I mentioned before, we have full stock of, you know, all of these really cool looking mugs, hats, jumpers, hoodies, t-shirts, mouse mats, stickers. You can stick these anywhere. Stick it on a microphone, stick it on your cheek. I don't know. I really like these designs. They're all unique, original, very groovy designs, I think. So if you want to support the channel, definitely give the shop a little visit down below. As a reminder, code ONETRUEFAN for 10% off everything, and the first 10 orders will receive a personalized little letter from yours truly. Not that that would sweeten the deal much, if at all, but yeah, it's just my way of saying thank you for being an early supporter. So tune in next week for hopefully a video very soon, and as always guys, thanks for watching.